Right, today's lesson is called City Streets. Now this is something that's really, really close to my heart because I was fortunate enough last year, I painted my way across America as part of a big project for UNICEF, and I started off in New York, my first visit to New York, and I was absolutely completely transfixed. Just an incredible city. And it was raining all the time I was there pretty much. I had these wet streets and everything was reflected. And I took some photos, did some work, did some paintings, took some sketches, and crucially I had one of my little tap bags with me. Now my tap bags are essentially, they're freezer bags, they're food bags, and I take them with me wherever I go, and I'm kind of like I'm a bit like a street urchin because I'm kind of scurrying around and I'm picking stuff up, litter off the streets and tickets and menus and all that kind of stuff. Pile it in my bag, label it, and then when I get back to my studio I've got this bag of what I call tat, which is ready for collage, and just takes me straight back there, so I can sort of empty my bag out and it really takes me back to the location. So it could be full of leaves from the woods, or it could be sand and shells from the beach. In this case it was full of New York litter, which I know sounds odd, but it was just perfect. And I've got some of that here, and I'm going to use it for collage in this painting. And obviously I'm guessing you're not going to have New York litter with you, but you could use any old magazine, newspaper, that kind of stuff, packaging. And I'm going to show you how I do it, and crucially why I do it, because it's not just used for gimmicky purposes, it's used for very specific purposes. But I also want to talk to you about the reflections, because that's what this is all about today. So it's all about reflections, perspective. It's taking essentially a really complicated subject and painting it in a really, really simple way. So let's do it. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is I'm going to show you a little trick. I'm just thinking we need to get some wet paint on here first of all. So I'm going to use I think I'm going to use a sponge. This is just an old bit of car wash sponge, ordinary sponge. And I'm just going to get it a little bit wet. And I'm looking at one of my photographs, and I've got these darks happening. So I'm going to mix up a dark colour. And for my dark, I'm going to take a little squodge of brown, there it is, and a little squodge of blue. And I call it brown and blue really because, well, it's brown and blue, but I also know that if you sitting at home, you might not have exactly the same colours as me. And to be honest with you, it doesn't really matter. Any brown, any blue will give you a nice dark. My ones that I've got here, I've got a phthalo blue and a burnt sienna, which work really well. But if you've got a burnt umber and an ultramarine, that works equally well. So a bit of dark colour. And all I'm going to do is, working from the top to the bottom, I'm just going to run that dark colour down over the buildings. There they are, just confident strokes. So I'm not kind of wiping, I'm not doing the, sort of Paso Doble snake hips or anything like that. It's quite controlled. This is the one time I am quite controlled. And I'm going to just confident strokes, running them down. And essentially it's because, more than anything, if we're looking here, we've got the buildings in shadow. And the shadows, of course, are just reflected straight down in the street. And I'm thinking, also, if we've got wet streets, why not use wet paint? That makes sense to me. So let's get that done. So you see, you've got a very sort of washed out dark, like a sort of like a bit of a grey, isn't it? But it's a nice colour, sort of a petrol grey. Okay. Wash our sponge out. I think that's it for our sponge, actually. Don't need a lot more work with the sponge. Okay, now I've got some really unconventional techniques to show you today. One of them includes painting with a credit card. There it is. It's just an old credit card. And I know you've got them in your wallets and in your purses, taking up space. One's, membership cards for things that you don't need anymore. Out of date cards. So just cut them up. They're fantastic because they give really nice sharp edges. They give really nice points, and they're flexible. So they kind of work in a bit like the palette knife. Work in a similar sort of way, just with slightly less control. So they're good to use. And something else I'm going to use, because we've got these verticals of these buildings, these really fantastic verticals coming down, instead of getting a brush and painting every line and each line, if I took a small brush, if I painted every line, to be fair, even me, the lines are going to be a little bit wobbly and they're not going to be quite right. So I could mask them. I could use, you know, a stencil or some kind like that. Or I like to use things like bits of old cardboard and just stamp the paint on. So I think we should do that. Let's have a little go. Feel free to pause this and go and find yourself a bit of cardboard. I'm sure you've got a piece somewhere. You've got a piece of cardboard somewhere. Have a look in your recycling. There's always stuff in your recycling. And this is corrugated cardboard. So I've got the lines on there already. And see what happens if this might not work, by the way. But if I wipe up some of my dark colour, let's see if this works. If I'm going to take, say, for instance, this building over on the left-hand side, will this give me some lines? Oh, it does. Gives me some lines. Are they perfect lines? No, they're not. Are they the right length? No, they're not. Are they in the right place? Probably not. But of course it doesn't matter, because all we just want some exciting verticals coming down. We don't need to know how many windows there are, how many windows there should be. That's largely irrelevant. What we need is just verticals. This is a neat way to paint verticals. We'll try some over on this side as well. So we're just stamping it on. In another way of stamping it on, let's mix up some more dark. Let's mix up a little more dark colour. Blue and brown. On it goes. And let's try a piece of card. Now this is just mount board. Any old piece of card will do, as long as it's reasonably firm. And we're just going to paint the edge of the cardboard. And we're going to just stamp the paint on. On it goes. How easy is that? So what I'm going to do is I'm putting the card on and then I'm just dragging it across. Just put it on and just drag it to one side, and that gives me that line. And of course these lines aren't perfect, but we don't want perfect, because perfect's boring. We want lines with energy. Touch more paint, and a few more little lines. On they go. And we can even, of course, just change the angles then. So suddenly we've got our verticals. We're working with our verticals because it's the big vertical city. You know, and of course, if you've ever visited New York, it's very vertical. You know, lots of enormously tall buildings that kind of dwarf you, make you feel really, really small, which is quite fascinating, actually. To be surrounded by such big architecture. You know, I'm from the far west of Cornwall in England, so the biggest thing I was ever surrounded by would be a tree. You know, so suddenly to find myself in New York, surrounded by enormous skyscrapers, was just visually really, really stimulating. And again, the streets are wet, so as the shadows of the buildings come down, we're just going to run them down over the pavement and over the street itself. Bring it right down. And can you see how, because I'm using card, I get a broken line. So the line isn't perfect. It's sort of, sometimes it leaves paint really quite heavily. Sometimes it runs out of paint, gives me a broken line. That's really exciting. That's really exciting for me, because I don't know exactly how the painting is going to turn out, and that's what keeps it exciting. And with that in mind, of course, if we're using this card for verticals, we can also use it for horizontals and for getting angles. So suddenly, we can suddenly have the street coming towards us just by using the same piece of card. Now, who'd have thought you could paint a picture using an old piece of card? It's great, isn't it? You know, we don't need hundreds of pounds worth of brushes, do we? Just a piece of old card. That's all we really need. It goes. And of course, having the drawing kind of sets us up, because we do need the perspective to be right. It's one of those things, if the perspective is wrong, the painting will look wrong. So we want the perspective to be right, but I've done the drawing for you. You've traced it out, you know, so we're confident that the perspective's right, and then we can just play. We can play with mark making. And playing with mark making is really exciting. So of course, I'm sure you remember from your school days, you know, all about perspective. You know, we've got our vanishing point. If we look at these lines, they all come to a vanishing point around the center of our painting here. So that's where our focus is going to be. That's the lines will all draw the eye straight into this area. So that's where our interest is going to happen. The rest of it is just kind of there, setting it up. Okay, let's get some darks down in this left-hand pavement, or sidewalk. I should call it a sidewalk, shouldn't I? There we have it. See these lines, these really, really interesting. Just by adding the paint and pulling down, gives me that drag of reflection. You know, so I put the card on, drag it down. Look at that. Oh, it's just like, oh, it's lovely. I'm all excited now. Oh, I've forgotten what I was going to say. I'm so excited. Okay, let's get some more. Use the other end of the card just for smaller lines. And again, the only real concentration I'm giving to this at this stage, looking for the darks and remembering my lines, remembering my vanishing point here in the middle. All right, okay. So we're kind of set up at the moment. Now, I'm just thinking, let's get some brushwork going, because these buildings are subtly different colours. They're all kind of greys, you know, and red greys of one form or another. But they are subtly different, and that'll give us a bit of depth. So let's take our dark colour, mix a touch of white with it. And we've got a nice sort of, it's almost like a sort of a sagey green. Let's get some of this into one of these buildings. Now again, you know, I'm using my brush strokes to follow the plane of the subject. So if I'm painting a vertical building, I use vertical strokes. Okay, so going up and down. Painting a vertical building, I'm not going to use horizontal strokes because it's not following the plane. I want to follow the plane of the building. So that's key. The same will be, for instance, if I'm painting water, which is horizontal, I'll use horizontal strokes. Okay, touch of water maybe. I should say this is my good old trusty number 4 flat brush that I'm sure, you know, I'm really good friends with this, and I'm sure if you followed these lessons you'll know this brush inside out. You'll know it as well as I do, because I use it all the time. Just get some interest happening. Now the buildings are in shadow as they come closer towards me. So with that in mind, I just want to darken it up slightly. Let's try a different blue. Let's try a touch of ultramarine. Ultramarine's another blue that I have in my palette here. I have ultramarine and phthalo blue. Ultramarine isn't as bright. It's more of a kind of a grey blue, which is great for New York, because New York's kind of quite a grey sort of city. You know, it's quite a sort of almost a European kind of city. You know, gets the drizzle, gets the rain. So it's certainly not California sunshine. So I'm just watered down that grey, that dark grey, water it right down, and confident strokes following the planes of the building. There we have it. Okay, and again, if we've got the darks up in the buildings, we want to bring them down into the wet pavement, into the wet sidewalk, into the wet road. Lovely. And I'm running the brush down. You can see how I'm pulling that brush down, and as I pull it down, the brush runs out of paint. And when the brush runs out of paint, it gives me a dragged line, broken dragged line. And a broken dragged line is perfect for wet roads. In actual fact, I'm looking at these shadows, and some of the shadows on the wet pavement and the wet road, they're actually darker than the areas above them that's creating the shadows. So that's quite an interesting thing with shadows. Sometimes shadows can be darker than the actual object that's creating them. Something to bear in mind. So we're just going to really darken down this right hand side. And it's interesting with reflections and shadows, the reflections are very often darker than the object that's making the reflection. So that's something to bear in mind. If we look at this, look at our source material, we'll see that in the reflected shadows, the reflected shadows are sometimes darker. If that makes sense. Does that make sense? It made sense to me at the time. It sort of doesn't make sense to me anymore. But anyway, you know where I'm going with it. Okay, touch more of the card and that same dark colour. Over on the right hand side. This is really like a study in grey almost, isn't it? But it won't be, we're going to jazz it up in a minute. Okay, touch more of our grey mix. Let's just temper this down slightly. If we've got our dark mix with our ultramarine here, let's add a touch of white to it just to lighten it slightly. Just going to slightly change these shades. So it's essentially the same colour, just slightly different tones. And if you can hear that rain, can you hear that rain? You know, we're painting a rainy city street. It's kind of, I ordered this rain to give us the atmosphere. Okay, and again, just following the plane of the buildings. Got some down there. I'm following the lines. So I'm talking a lot about my brush strokes following the plane of the building. Of course, we've also got those converging lines going into our vanishing point in the middle. So we are allowed now and again to use lines following those vanishing points. Vanishing point lines, I should say. To give us that sense of depth. Okay, And again, the same thing over on the left hand side. Going to darken up, there's some cars there. Let's just darken up around those cars a little. Bit of our dark colour, blue and brown. Now using these blue and brown darks are much more versatile than using a black. You know, it's easy to squeeze out the black when we want the darks, but blacks can be really, really difficult to control. They're very, very strong colour, and they can be really dominant. So by mixing our own black colours, our own darks, means they're much easier to control. It also means the beauty of it gives a much better sense of unity, because we're using less colours or less tones, less shades. And if our darks are made of colours that we're using elsewhere in the painting, the viewer's eye will bounce the eye around and create a really harmonious effect. So mixing our own darks is really key. So if you've got a tube of black, then just throw it away, give it away. And these cars, I've sort of sketched them in roughly, just little window shapes and tyre hub shapes. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to block in the rest of the car shape with my dark colour, because the cars aren't our subject. They're there, they're in the photograph, but they're not our subject. So we could easily leave them out. I chose not to leave them out because I like to have them there to give a sense of scale. They help with a sense of scale because we know how big cars are. So as soon as we know how big an object is in a painting, it gives us an automatic sense of scale. Okay, so all we're really doing was just knocking this area into shadow, that sort of, that right hand side. Just using our darks. And again, converging lines as we go into our vanishing point. So I can add some darks into the road, should I wish to draw the eye in. And it goes, following the road into the distance. Okay, same over, I'm just working from the left hand side to the right hand side. And again, if I've got a dark reflection in the street, I also want some darks in the building above to have created that. And again, can you see if I paint this with a brush, I'll paint it with the brush first, you know, that's okay, but it's a little bit wibbly wobbly, isn't it? A little bit wibbly wobbly. And bear in mind, you know, I know what I'm doing as well, and even with me, it's wibbly wobbly. Far better, in which case, to paint with the piece of card instead gives us a much straighter line, got much more energy in it. Okay, let's get some more, change the colours slightly. So I'm going to get that blue grey colour that we had, touch more white. We'll get that on there with the card as well. Why not? While we've got it. It's good fun, isn't it, painting with cards? Okay. So I'm pulling it towards me, or pulling it across. Touch more white, so we're knocking it back even paler. Okay. And again, when we're using the card, of course, you get the broken line. Touch of paint happened down here, some of it happened up here, it missed out in the middle. That's not something you can control, and that's what's really exciting about this way of working. We don't want to be in complete control. Now it's getting interesting now. It's getting that sort of metropolis kind of feel to it. Let's get some more whites. So if you find that your card, like mine, is actually getting a little bit soggy now, you know, we just get another piece of card. As soon as it gets soggy, we get sort of curvy lines. We don't really want curvy lines. Not for a city. And in our source photograph, the build as the street kind of goes away from us, the buildings become more and more hazy, and they almost kind of disappear into the sky. You know, it's got that sort of steamy element to it. So we can let that happen. Just let the card run out of paint. Let's just try the end. So you've still got this pale colour, same pale colour all the time. And I'm just going to drag it across the road. So I'm talking to you a lot about painting the plane of a building, which is vertical, painting the converging lines to our vanishing point. But of course, if we're painting the plane of a road, the road is horizontal. So we've got the converging lines, but we've got horizontal lines as well. So all of a sudden, we're allowed to put horizontals in, and horizontals coming across our shadows, our reflected shadows, gives us that real sense of wetness. Suddenly, that road is wet, isn't it? Suddenly there it is. Nice wet road. There we go. Touch more. Touch more of the converging lines. Now, of course, you know, this kind of way of working with these pieces of card could work for things like railway lines or roads or buildings. Anything where we want nice crisp lines. Okay, back to the brush, I think. No, I tell you what, not back to the brush. Let's go back to, let's try the credit card. Now, this works in the same way as the piece of card, but of course it doesn't get soggy, and we've got a point on it as well because I've cut it at an angle. Can you see that angle? Cut it at the angle, so I've got a nice point. So with that in mind, let's get some of our colour onto our credit card. And same thing, we can use it for getting those interesting marks on the buildings, the nice straight lines, but crucially, you know, we can get smaller lines, more subtle lines. Now, I challenge you to try and do this with a paintbrush actually, because to paint these kind of buildings with a paintbrush is quite difficult. And the reason it's difficult is because obviously a paintbrush, even a small one, if you look at a paintbrush, they're round and they're soft. So soft round paintbrushes give us soft round lines, and soft round brush strokes and lines aren't what architecture's made of. Architecture tends to be sharp, particularly these kind of buildings. And so if we're painting sharp lines, we need a sharp implement to do it with. So something like this or a palette knife is perfect. Okay, just adding in some whites. Just looking at the photograph, looking for whites. There they are, little highlights. Get that interest in there. all the time I'm thinking about the converging lines, the vanishing point in the middle. Suddenly we're getting depth, aren't we? Suddenly we're getting to that stage that we can almost walk into the painting, walk down that street. So it's going to get a little bit of work happening in this end, at the very end of our street there. So let's mix up a touch of, what should we call it? Let's have a touch of the ultramarine, touch of the brown to give us that nice dark colour. And let's just get a little bit of action. So I'm going to hold the brush right on the ferrule there, just in front of the bristles. And I'm going to use that corner, bottom corner, just to dot and dash some marks in, just by wiggling my fingers and letting the brush dance across the page. Okay. So we're just going to get the darks in there first, and I know that there's colour down there. We can get to the colour in a moment. Just going to get the darks in there. Where's that paint? There it is. Okay. And while we've got the paint on our brush, why not dab in a few more of the darks in the buildings as we're coming in this direction? Be a shame to waste it, wouldn't it? So let's just dab some of these in. Now I've got two palettes here that both look exactly the same, and I keep forgetting which one I'm mixing the paint in. So you've got to remind me, just shout out, no, the wrong one, if you see me heading towards the wrong one. To just darken up the darks if they need it. Okay, same here. Okay, so I'm just thinking this area here is just too pale, isn't it? We all agreed on that, it's right hand side. So with that in mind, I'm just going to get my dark, touch of water, and we'll just block that in. And what that's hopefully going to do is it'll stop our eye drifting off to the side. So it's all about the composition. Stop our eye drifting off to the side. We still know it's a building. We don't need to know how many windows it's got. We don't need to know the architectural details of it. We just need to know it's a building, and that's enough for us. There it is. Same thing on the other side. I'm just looking at these windows. There's these sort of big, huge, sort of dark windows coming down. So again, let's get some of those in. I'm going to use the credit card. Could use a brush, but I showed you earlier, you know, a brush gives a sort of a soft line, which we don't want. And we're just going to drag the card across to give us those sort of dark window shapes. And can you see how where the card runs out of paint towards the bottom, we even get the sense of shadow happening just automatically. You know, that's not by judgment, it really is by luck, but it's just the way it works, because we're working from the top corner backwards towards ourselves, runs out of paint towards the bottom, gives us that sense of shadow. So we can use these kind of happy accidents to our advantage really, really well. And I think let's get a bit of a converging line up here. So suddenly we've got the buildings coming down the street, we've got a nice shadow happening by accident, which is just, you know, I just love it when things happen by accident and they kind of just, you know, hit the nail on the head for me. That's just wonderful. Okay. So we've got to this stage. All we've really used is kind of dirty greys, haven't we? Sort of grey blues. and we've got to this stage. Now let's get some of our whites in here. So I'm looking down the very end of the painting, looking down through, and we've got the whites. So let's get some titanium white, good old squodge, no water, just a big old squodge of paint on the end. And just using the brush, let's just get it into those end buildings. And I'm bringing it down, if I do it slowly, I'm bringing the brush down over those buildings and just letting them kind of disappear into the whiteness. And that would give us a real sense of the street being very, very long. And the same up above. Same thing, it kind of just disappears slightly. Gives us that sense of very bright sunlight down there. This is an interesting way of working, isn't it? Sort of working almost back to front. We're sort of putting the work in and then we're taking it back out by getting white down over the top of it. And the same thing down in the street, of course, because if we've got that happening in the sky, we need that reflected down here. And again, while we've got the brush in our hand with the white paint, let's give it some horizontals because we're following the plane of the road, so we're getting horizontals in there. And it's neat paints, there's no water, so when we put the paint on, the roughness of the paper gives us a nice broken line. Broken lines in this case are great because broken lines give us a sense of sparkle, a sense of water. Oh, now look, this street is really wet now. I'm pretty pleased with this street actually. That's looking really nice and wet. Okay, let's get some converging lines going on down the street. These sort of tarmacy repair type lines. There you go. It's almost got the feel of a sort of a 1920s film noir kind of street, hasn't it? And a few dots, maybe a few dots as the street comes towards us, gives that extra sparkle, that bigger sparkle, because the sparkles are bigger as they come towards us. Lovely. And right on cue as we're painting the wet street, here's more rain, I'm sure you can hear. Okay, I'm just going to mix up a tiny touch of blue. I want to get a little bit of colour into the sides of these streets, but not too much. So I'm going to take a bit of phthalo blue. Now phthalo blue is a really sort of an intense blue. Knock it back a little bit with some white. Okay. Tiny touch of water, so it's just off kind of being raw, if you like, straight from the tube. And we're going to dab in a few little touches, just using the corner of the brush, you know, to signify part of the cars, for instance. And if we're adding it to the car, we're going to add it to the street below as well. Just tiny touches. And the same over on the side, over on the right-hand side. On the right-hand side, you know, these blues can be signposts, they can be reflected windows. Doesn't really matter what they are. What does matter is that we follow those converging lines. Now, in the photograph, we've got some almost like a orangey building kind of coming up on the side here. We can do that, we can add it. I'm not sure if it's going to help actually. I actually prefer it as grey, but we're going to add some in anyway, just to show you we can. I'm going to use my burnt sienna, and burnt sienna is really translucent, so adding water to burnt sienna gives me a fantastic sort of orange glaze. And if I just run my brush down over that building with the orange glaze, just gives us that streak of colour there. You know, does it help, doesn't it? You know, I'm in two minds, but we'll do it anyway, just to show you how we can subtly change those colours should we want to. Okay. So it's all about decision making, you know, this kind of way of painting, isn't it? It's deciding what to add, what to leave out. You know, we don't need to add everything. That's the key to successful painting, really, is, you know, choosing what to leave out. It's almost as important as choosing what to put in. It really is. Well, perhaps it does add a little bit actually, just kind of brings it in, doesn't it? Okay. Now there's some red in here. We want to get some red. This is just a cadmium red, bog standard cadmium red. There it is. Let's have a little touch on the corner of the brush, straight from the tubes. There's no water involved, and we're just gonna dot some in. We've got a couple of little traffic lights up here. Dot those in. We've got some brake lights on the cars at the ends. Now what that will do, of course, by having these little touches of red, will really draw the eye straight in. So that's key. And then, of course, if we've got those there, we've also got the reflected versions. So you've got the reflections coming down. And we've got the reflections down in the road and in the sidewalk. That's looking okay. It's looking pretty good. Okay, now we've got the flags and things like that in the buildings. It's up to you. You can put them in if you want. I think I'm going to leave those out. I don't think they're necessary. But I do think what is necessary is getting some of these highlights on some of these cars. So again, exactly the same thing as with the red, just a little touch of neat white paint on the side on the corner of the brush. And we're just going to dab it in as we see fit on these cars. Again, if you're really into your cars and you want to paint your car so you make sure it looks like a Ford, then that's absolutely fine. For me, I don't need to do that. I don't want to do that. I just want the fact that there's some vehicles there, and it just gives that sense of life, and they converge down the street. Gives me that bustle. Okay, and then a little bit of action in the end of the street now. So we're going to have some more highlights, just dotted highlights, and just by using that corner of that brush, we could use a small brush, we could use a palette knife, just by using the corner and getting small marks in, just gives us a sense of movement. We know there's something happening down there. Okay, let's get a bit of scratchy going on. Now, this is a scalpel. It's like a sophisticated craft knife, if you like. Craft knives work equally as well. Very, very sharp, so be careful. And these ones just have little blades that I can pop in and out as they go blunt. But they're fantastic for scratching the paint. So if I want small little lines, I can easily just scratch the paint back out. So I'll try it on this side as well so you can see. If I scratch, can you see that scratches the paint off the top surface of the paper? And you can hear it as it kind of scumbles along. And what it's doing is it's just taking the paint off the top surface and leaving it in the little dips, which gives me a broken line, a really nice broken line. This works beautifully on canvases as well. Watercolor paper works equally well. But what we're not doing, we're not cutting. So I'm not holding the knife, I'm not cutting the paper. I'm holding it side on and I'm scratching the paper. Okay, so that's an important distinction. We're not cutting, we're pulling and scratching. And we can scratch lines, we can scratch points of light. Well, see, that's got a real convergence now, actually. Same down here. Can you hear that rain? It's pretty intense, isn't it? But perfect for painting a wet city, eh? Okay. I think we need some yellow in here as well, because we haven't got any yellow yet. I like to get, if I'm going to have some action and some colour, I like to get primary colours in there. So whether it's a yellow or a red, or both, kind of just supercharges it. So just palette knife. I picked this up without showing you, didn't I? But this palette knife is one of my favourites. You get palette knives in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Palette knives are fantastic. This is my favourite size. It's kind of just a small diamond shape, and they're flexible. And I can spread paint on with the flat bottom of it. I can get lines with the sides, and I can get points, tiny little marks on the points. These are fantastic. Okay, so I'm just adding some yellows and some reds and maybe even some whites with the palette knife. Again, could use the card, could even use the scalpel, just to give us some interest down there, so we know that there's some action happening. We don't need to know what it is, we don't need to know if it's cars or people, what it is. It's just a piece of action. Okay, there's a few things I want to talk to you about just to finish this off. Now I'm going to talk to you about collage. Now collage is fantastic for street scenes, for towns, for cities, because we can get signs happening, we can get all sorts of action happening. Now I've got this bit of old litter from New York. As I told you, I have my tap bag with me and I pick up old tickets and menus and all sorts of stuff like that. So here's some of it. Now obviously you're not going to have, I'm guessing, unless you happen to live in New York, you're not going to have any New York litter. But as an experiment, try just using, you know, a bit of your TV listings magazine, you know, or piece of the newspaper, anything like that. Some packaging works well as well. Just going to cut out small areas. Now, the beauty of collage really is that I get nice crisp edges. I get colours that I wouldn't usually use. I get text, I get numbers happening, and they all feed into, woo, I'll cut another one, I just dropped that one. Let me cut another one. They all feed into giving the impression that we've got signs and lettering and advertising. Let's use a glue stick. And then we're going to get some, oh, she have it. Let's have some there. Suddenly, we've got some interest happening. Now, it's all about the lettering and the numbers and the shapes, because of course to paint this is quite difficult. To paint advertising, to paint signs is difficult, and it's a bit of a faff, to be honest with you. It's a bit of a pain, and to my mind it never looks as good as a bit of juicy collage. You know, collage is a lot sexier. So there's a couple of little bits there, a few other colours. What else have we got here? Let's have a little bit of pink. Here's some pink. You know, on this same trip, when I was painting my way across America, I ended up in Las Vegas. Las Vegas, the sort of craziest place I've probably ever been in my entire life. And I was collecting litter from the streets all the time. And I won't go into the litter that I was collecting, but you can probably imagine. And I produced images of Las Vegas just made out of collage. So there's very little paint, if any, just cut up paper, put down, and I was able to kind of create some Las Vegas images. So collage is kind of key. Oh, look at that. So I'm thinking, when I'm putting the collage on, I'm thinking where it's going to be, in as much as I've got the converging lines, and this is advertising and signs. So advertising and signs are going to be same sort of height as a person, maybe higher, but certainly not really high. So I'm not going to go putting collage really high up in the painting, because that kind of wouldn't make sense. If I keep it at sort of my figure's eye level or just above that, it does make sense. Okay, don't need a lot, just a few little areas here and there. You know, for demonstration purposes, I'm putting this on sort of quite quickly, and you will obviously understand that collage can be used much more carefully than this, much more, you know, better placed to get really fantastic effects. But for demonstration, this is ideal. Actually, it's working out really well. Get rid of that bit, and we'll have a little touch down here. Let's have that there. So it's kind of an intuitive thing. I'm sort of, that's the beauty of collage, of course, is that I can put it down without gluing it. So I can put it down first, and I can think, does that work? Doesn't it work? If it doesn't work, I just move it. I can move it around until it works, and then once it's in place and I think that's it, it gets pasted down, and that really is it. And I think we're going to have this one, maybe. See, I'm playing around, oh, just there, to bring the eye in. And that, my little city slickers, I think is it. We've got our wet street. It looks soaking wet. I've ordered the rain turned up on time, exactly as I said it would. And I think we're done. All we need are little mounts, a couple of little L-shaped mounts, and see if we can crop this in, see how it's looking. See if it's making sense. All of a sudden, we've got a cold, wet New York street.